Okay, y'all. Sorry that it's April, almost May, and I'm still trying different things, but um, we're gonna try reading the whole chapter here, and then maybe doing it over the course of a couple days together. So bear with me. We'll see how this goes. All right, so we're on Unit 9, Chapter 21, Section 1.1, Medieval Europe. The Germanic tribes that caused the fall of the Western Roman Empire in AD 476 didn't just devastate towns and kill many of their inhabitants. They destroyed a way of life. For hundreds of years, the Roman Empire had united much of Europe. With the empire no longer in control, now what? Could well have been the question on almost everyone's mind. So Rome is gone, at least Western Rome. People are like, all right, what now? After the fall of Rome, what came next is a period historians call the Middle Ages. This era lasted from about 500 to 1450 AD in Western Europe and is also called the medieval period. Medieval comes from the Latin words medium meaning middle, and avum meaning age. So medieval, Middle Ages, same thing. During the early part of this period, Western Europe was very different from what it had been under Rome's strong central government and powerful army. After Rome fell, Germanic leaders seized power, and much of the region became divided into small kingdoms that were almost constantly at war. As a result of this widespread warfare, one of the greatest challenges facing leaders was to keep their people safe and secure. This challenge would help shape governments over time. It was a violent time, yet many kingdoms thrived. Thanks to the region's mostly moderate climate and rich soil, farmers could grow crops and feed themselves and their livestock. This is a picture of farm life, what life was like for people during this time. Kind of looks like a maze. Abundant forest land provided wood for building, and mountains containing a wealth of minerals, particularly iron, allowed the Germanic peoples to make all the weapons they needed to fight their foes. In addition, Western Europe's long coastline and major rivers gave people access to the sea and plentiful supplies of fish. Political and cultural changes. The region's many waterways offered ideal routes and networks for trading. However, unlike the Romans, the Germanic peoples who migrated to Western Europe were not interested in trade. The tribes that settled in Roman lands in the early part of the Middle Ages preferred their own traditions to Roman ways. For example, the new settlers had their own ideas about government. Tribes, such as the Franks, united to form powerful kingdoms, but didn't create large centralized governments or write down their laws as the Romans had. Instead, the people obeyed the unwritten rules and traditions of their king. They lived in small villages where they worked the land and tended their herds. As trade began to disappear in the region, so did many cities. Just about the only force that helped unite Western Europe in the Middle Ages was Christianity, which survived the fall of Rome. Before the 500s, most Germanic peoples, including the Angles, Jutes, and Saxons, practiced their traditional religions and worshipped many gods. After the Germanic leaders came to power, however, many of them converted or changed their religion to Christianity. The first leader to convert was Clovis, who ruled the Franks. After Clovis defeated Roman Gaul, now France, in 486, he went on to conquer other weaker kingdoms. When he converted to Christianity, many of his subjects did too. This is kind of a theme throughout history, guys. Once the king converts to whatever religion, a lot of the people tend to follow. As a result of his conversion and that of other rulers, Christianity spread and increased in influence. Even though the Western Roman Empire had disappeared, the city of Rome itself retained a certain amount of power and strength. It remained the home of the Pope as well as the center of Christianity. All right, section 1.2, Charlemagne. He was a man of contrasts. He ruthlessly destroyed his enemies, but loved learning. He was a tall, commanding figure, but usually wore simple clothing. He received fabulous gifts from foreign kings, but collected songs of ancient Germanic heroes. In spite of, or maybe because of, these contradictions are two things that disagree with each other. He became the first emperor in Western Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They didn't call this king of the Franks Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, for nothing. A mighty ruler. More than 200 years after Clovis died, Charlemagne became the Frankish king in 768 and proved to be a natural leader. He had a vision for his reign. Charlemagne wanted to unite, under his rule, all of the Germanic tribes shown on the map in the previous lesson. To achieve that goal, the Frankish king battled such tribes as the Slavs, the Lombards, and the Saxons, who reigned in what is now Germany. In the end, Charlemagne succeeded. He brought many of the Germanic tribes together as one people and became the strongest leader in Western Europe. So these are the kingdoms he was talking about, y'all. So see all of these kingdoms here. This is what Charlemagne was trying to unite under one kingdom. While Charlemagne was doing battle with the Saxons and other powerful Germanic tribes, he ably administered his kingdom. He established new laws to keep order and appointed officials to run faraway regions of his realm. Each year, Charlemagne called the officials to his court to keep tabs on them. He also took care of his subjects. He founded schools and protected the weak against injustice. Above all, he wanted to strengthen Christianity throughout his kingdom, a Christian empire. Like all Frankish kings since the 500s, Charlemagne was a Christian. In fact, his wars against the Germanic tribes had been fought not only to unite the tribes, but to spread his faith. After he conquered the Saxons, he declared that he would put to death anyone who refused to convert to Christianity. That's not great. Since Charlemagne had already proved how ruthless he could be by slaughtering more than 4,000 Saxons who had fought against him, those who remained offered no further resistance. Charlemagne was also a loyal defender of the Pope at the time, Pope Leo III. After the Pope passed laws that chipped away at the power of the nobles of Rome, they rebelled against him in 800. Leo asked for Charlemagne's help, and the king put the uprising down. To express his gratitude, Leo crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans during a Christmas service in Rome. Charlemagne became the first German emperor of what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire. The title recognized Charlemagne as guardian of Christianity. It also fueled his passion to strengthen the church. By the time Charlemagne died in 814, he had created a strong Christian empire. Okay, we skipped section 1.3. We don't need that one, so now we're on chapter 21, section 1.4. Feudal society. The united Europe that Charlemagne had fought so hard to establish didn't last very long. About 30 years after his death in 814, his empire was divided into 3 kingdoms. Frankish rule grew weak, and Western Europe fell back into disorder. Once again, the Germanic kingdoms competed for power. A new system. Kings in Western Europe and England could not defend their vast kingdoms on their own. To help them hold on to their land and protect their subjects, a political and social system called feudalism developed by the 800s. In this system, kings gave pieces of their land to noblemen known as lords. A lord, in turn, granted parts of this land, called fiefs, to lesser noblemen, called vassals. The vassals paid taxes on the land and pledged their military service to the lord. This meant that a vassal had to organize his own army of fighting men. Many vassals were themselves soldiers in the army and served as knights, who were warriors on horseback. The lord protected his vassals in exchange for their service. Vassals were supposed to be loyal to the king, but many vassals switched their allegiance to their lord. This was the man who guarded their families, after all. As a result, lords were supreme rulers in their own territory. A new social order. The new system created a social order that was as tightly structured as a pyramid. At the very top sat the king. Next came church officials and noblemen, who included lords and some vassals. The lords lived in fortified castles that were guarded by knights, the third class in feudal society. Relatively few people belonged to the upper 3 classes. The great majority of people in the Middle Ages found themselves at the bottom of the social heap. This included peasants and serfs. Although some peasants worked as artisans and merchants, most were farmers and laborers. Serfs, were tied to the land and gave their lord most of what they produced. In return, their lord gave them shelter and protection. Serfs weren't quite slaves, almost, but not quite. They were allowed to buy their freedom. Yet, with no skills or education to help them earn money, they were basically powerless to change their condition. So, This pyramid over here kind of shows you like the levels. So you had the king on top, all right, and he would hand out land to nobles and religious people, all right, and then they would loan out land to these guys, knights, all right, and then knights would fight and protect. And then at the very bottom, you had these poor people that were serfs and peasants, and they lived on the land, but were basically slaves. All right, so this is kind of the order, the pyramid. So king had all the land, loaned some of it to nobles. Nobles then, in turn, would loan out some of their land to these guys, and then these people would live on the land and actually work it and farm and dig and mine and all that sort of thing. Right, so that's kind of the system they had going. Okay, we didn't need section 1.5 or 1.6, so over here to section 2.1 in chapter 9. 1.5 was a suit of armor, kind of like explaining the parts of it. So if that's your thing, you might want to look at it, but didn't have to. All right, 2.1, church and crown. Light streams through stained glass windows in the great church, inspiring worship. The ceiling seems to rise to heaven. It took decades and even centuries to construct cathedrals in the Middle Ages, some bigger than a king's castle. They were built for the greater glory of God, but they were also meant to inspire awe in the wealth and power of the church. One other thing I'll say is most people at the time couldn't read, so having pictures and paintings and stuff on the walls were a lot of times the only way they could, like whoever was trying to teach could refer to them to show people what they were talking about. Since they couldn't read the Bible or read any books, that was a way for them to understand. The role of the church. It is hard for people today to understand the extraordinary power Christianity had in the Middle Ages. The Roman Catholic Church dominated people's lives from cradle to the grave. It was the strongest unifying force in medieval Europe. The church baptized, married, pardoned, and buried everyone from serfs to kings. It promised that good people would go to heaven and that wicked people would be punished after death. The religious leaders who oversaw these ceremonies and delivered the teachings, formed the clergy. The Pope led this group, which included bishops and priests. While a priest was in charge of a single church, a bishop oversaw a group of churches. Bishops exercised their authority from towering churches called cathedrals, the skyscrapers of their day. Some Christians withdrew from medieval society to live in religious communities called monasteries. Monks, the people who lived in a monastery, spent much of their day praying, reading the Bible, and meditating. In addition, rulers and high-ranking clergy sometimes had monks make copies of ancient Greek and Roman texts. As a result, monks helped keep knowledge alive, and monasteries became centers of learning. Struggle for power. If anything, the power and wealth of the church began increasing in the 1000s, in part because it received free land from nobles. At the same time, however, kings began to regain their former authority. The king's return to power was largely because of the growth of towns and trade, which you will learn more about later. The king's rise weakened the feudal structure, but it also led to a power struggle between kings and the church. The struggle came to a head in 1075. The German king, Henry IV, was next in line to become Holy Roman Emperor. Like Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, Henry ruled over a multi-ethnic group of territories in Central Europe, an empire that would continue until it dissolved in 1806. Henry had appointed his own priests to become bishops, but Pope Gregory VII claimed that these were religious appointments and should be his decision. The conflict raged until Gregory shut Henry out of the church, forcing the king to back down. Henry knew that if he did not, he would lose his throne. In those days, no one would have anything to do with a king who had been banished from the church. Gregory got his way and lifted the ban. He then regained full control of religious appointments. And this picture over here is just a big cathedral, apparently Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Okay, Unit 9, Chapter 21, Section 2.2, King John and the Magna Carta. Here's a joke told by English school children. Where did King John sign the Magna Carta? At the bottom. Ha ha ha. That's terrible. Actually, it was in a meadow called Runnymede, and he didn't sign it. He placed his seal on it, and it was called the Articles of the Barons then. The barons, a group of noblemen, were not amused by the growing authority of the king. the Great Charter. In the last lesson, you read that kings were regaining their power. King John was one in a long line of powerful English kings that began in 1066. In that year, William, Duke of Normandy, a region in France, invaded England and established a strong centralized monarchy there. When John rose to the throne in 1199, he ruled England and half of present-day France. However, the king soon weakened his position by waging a series of failed, expensive wars. This is also something that should sound familiar to y'all. Failed, expensive wars lead to collapsing kingdoms. A group of local barons took advantage of John's decreased power to stage a rebellion. And there we go. The barons believed that by raising their taxes, the king had violated common law. This was a system of law established in the 1100s that sought to ensure people throughout England received equal treatment. So in 1215, the barons forced John to place his seal on their document, which came to be known as the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. And there are 4 copies of this that still exist. Here is one. So that's kind of crazy. Like a 1,000-year-old document. I guess 800 years old. Cool, though. It was meant to be just a contract between the king and his nobles. However, the Magna Carta made the king subject to the law of the land and limited his authority. A step toward democracy. Although the Magna Carta didn't benefit ordinary English people at the time, its guarantee of certain individual rights would have a great impact on the development of democracy. The document is recognized as the foundation of English law. A further step toward democracy, in the form of representative government, took place in 1258. Henry III, John's son, was King of England at the time. Like his father, he had angered a group of nobles. The nobles overruled Henry's authority and put together a council of 15 men to advise the king and limit his power. This group of representatives would come to be called a parliament. After King Henry died in 1272, his son Edward I rose to the throne. In 1295, Edward assembled what is considered the first truly representative parliament. The group included 2 knights from every county and 2 residents from each town. They passed laws, imposed taxes, and discussed political and judicial matters. From that point on, English kings would have to share their power, whether they liked it or not. Chapter 21, Lesson 2.4, Section 2.4, The Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II condemned a group of people who had invaded the lands of the Christians. The people Urban referred to were Muslims, and he called on Christians to wage war against them. Kings had regained a good bit of their authority, but the church and the Pope still had plenty of power. Certainly enough for the Pope to gather armies and fight the spread of Islam. Battle for Palestine. Specifically, the people Urban had condemned were Seljuk Turks, Muslim rulers who had seized control of Jerusalem in 1071. Their takeover had made Christian pilgrimages to the Holy Land, also called Palestine, almost impossible. The Holy Land included Jerusalem and the area around the cities, sites that were sacred to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The Seljuks had also begun to attack the Christian Byzantine Empire, once the eastern half of the Roman Empire. We already learned about that. When the Byzantine emperor asked for his help, Pope Urban seized his chance to rally Christians against the growing power of Islam. His words had the desired effect. In 1096, Christian armies set off to fight a series of wars called the Crusades to reclaim the Holy Land. Christian leaders and soldiers were motivated by a desire to protect Christians and to slow the spread of Islam. Peasants, knights, and foot soldiers joined the fight, and they achieved victory. In 1099, the army retook Jerusalem and divided the Holy Land into 4 Crusader states. But the triumph was short-lived. In 1144, so like 45 years later, the Muslims fought back and conquered Edessa, one of the Crusader states. Soon after, a new pope launched a second crusade. But this ended in disaster for the Europeans. A third and fourth crusade were fought, but these also failed to defeat the enemy. By 1291, Muslims had defeated the Crusaders, and taken control of Palestine. The Crusades were over. A Spanish Crusade. The Crusades had an unexpected impact on Europe. During the wars, trade between Europe and the eastern Mediterranean region greatly increased because of greater contact between the two regions. After the wars, ideas as well as goods were exchanged. The trade led to a rise of a merchant class in Europe and the further decline of feudalism. Still, crusading fever didn't die, and hostility toward any non-Christians increased. As soldiers galloped toward the Holy Land, they killed Jews in Europe as well as those in Palestine. After the Crusades, many Jews were expelled from England and France. The greater expulsion effort, however, took place on the Iberian Peninsula, which includes present-day Spain and Portugal. In the 700s, Muslims had conquered almost the entire peninsula. When Islamic rule weakened in the 1000s, Christian kings began a long war called the Reconquista to drive the Muslims off the peninsula. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain stepped up the war. They used a powerful court known as the Inquisition to punish non-Christians. The court ordered the torture and execution of many Muslims and Jews who would not convert or who had converted but secretly practiced their former religion. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella finally defeated and expelled the last of the Muslim rulers and their followers from Spain and Portugal. They also drove out about 200,000 Jews. Unlike the Crusades, the Reconquista achieved its goal, but at the cost of many human lives. And up here we have a map that shows the different Crusades and the lands that were involved. So, well, I'm sure we'll be looking at that more. Chapter 21, Section 2.7. This is the last one we're going to do. Growth of towns. In the late Middle Ages, a saying started making the rounds. Town air makes you free. In the towns, you could work at a job and keep all your wages. You could go anywhere you wanted without having to ask anyone's permission because you were no longer bound to a land-owning lord or vassal. In fact, you answered to no one but the king. Economic opportunities arise. People had been moving to town since about 1000, but the bubonic plague greatly accelerated this movement. We'll talk about that later. That was, if you think the COVID pandemic is bad, the bubonic plague was crazy bad. With about a third of the workforce wiped out by the disease, employers desperate for help increased wages to attract workers. Many peasants and serfs as well left the manor to apply for jobs in the towns. As a result, the manor system began to fall apart. After life on the manor, the bustling, exciting towns might have made for a welcome change. Towns held weekly markets where local produce was sold, while town fairs brought in trade goods from other places. In time, a merchant class composed of traders and craftspeople arose. Wealthy town-dwelling merchants, known as burghers, could be elected to sit on governing councils. Groups of craftspeople, such as shoemakers or silversmiths, joined together to form guilds, which helped protect and improve the working conditions of their members. Video game players, the word guild might sound familiar. I want this open. So these places were where some of them were where the guilds would meet. So like the Sailors Guild, I believe, is this one here. So that's where they would meet to discuss their business. The Middle Ages end. The growth of towns and their prosperous trade further helped kings regain their authority. By taxing the towns within his realm, a king earned money to pay for his army. A strong army brought peace and stability to his land. Increasingly, power and people's loyalty shifted from local lords to their king. Europe experienced cultural changes as well as economic and political ones. You may remember the Crusades brought European traders into contact with the civilizations of Islam and Byzantium. These civilizations had preserved the writings of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers in their libraries. As the Middle Ages came to a close, people became eager to gain knowledge. Universities were founded to satisfy this desire for learning. Monasteries were no longer the only centers of education. After centuries of war, instability, and fear, Europe was more than ready to embark on a new age